Hello.
Hello,
Welcome
hello.
to episode 8
8.
of It's Your
It's
Time.
your time you're wasting.
One of these days, Martin, we're going to sync that up and it's going to be slick and flawless, but it's not this day.
Probably not until we're in the same room together, which we're, of course, not allowed to be.
Well, not unless I think
Well,
we
there's
might
six of us.
even.
6 of
Yeah,
us are allowed to be, aren't they? But,
yeah. I think just the two of us, we could have
but,
an.
not, but you must work from home if you can.
Yes, and so today, my Friday is my day working from home, and so that's been quite nice. I spent the week obviously in schools, beavering away at the chalk face. It's exhausting stuff, Martin. Who knew teachers work pretty hard?
I know it's the sort of thing that only teachers know how exhausting it is.
There's nothing quite like, in my experience, there's nothing quite like a 5-period day.
Yeah. And year 9's on the last thing as well.
Who you gotta love them.
I do. I love teaching year 9's actually, but it's certainly exhausting. You had to be on your toes.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, definitely have to be on, and especially these days with many teachers being peripatetic and wandering from classroom to classroom as the children stay static. Absolutely have to be on your toes. So, teachers, you've had an exhausting week. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of It's Your Time You're Wasting. And we've got a real treat for the viewers this week, Martin, haven't we?
Yeah, it's CEO time now. What's a CEO? It's a new thing, isn't it? I mean, well, newish in this.
It is. So we're delving into the world of the Multi Academy Trust, and we're going to start off the show by talking to Sir David Carter and Laura McInerney, and they have written a book about leading Multi Academy Trusts, and that's published by our show sponsors, John Catt. And I recorded an interview with them earlier today, and it was probably, I think, it's the longest interview we've ever done. Which, maybe that's not the best selling point, but it was a fascinating talk, and we've edited it down. We've got about 10-15 minutes from that interview. But for our subscribers, Martin, we're going to be releasing the full unexpected interview later in the week.
Subscribe down there. That's the way.
Good pointing, Mr. Robinson. Yeah,
so
absolutely certain that you're subscribing because you won't want to miss that. It's a great book, and it was a fascinating chat. And then you, Martin, have spoken to a couple of CEOs as well.
Yes, I've talked to Desmond Dean of the Odyssey Trust in Southeast London, and that's a fascinating interview. We're talking about mainly the white working class, but we also talk about but this I think is in the one that comes out during the week, about the interesting trust he has, which is a grammar school and a secondary modern. So quite an interesting mix there. Then following on from that, or shall we say, not the last, being left to last is not the least, or whatever, is Stuart Locke, and he's talking about his trust over there in Bedfordshire. But in today's talk, we're going to look mainly at exams and all the kerfuffle about exams going on this week. And a letter he wrote to the Sunday Telegraph, no less.
He did. Yes, many viewers will have seen that, and it's at the moment, obviously, it's still. Well, at the moment, we're committing to exams, but I think it's anyone's guess as to what might happen later on down the line. One of the things that came out of my talk with Laura and Sir David was that Laura was recommending that we leave the final decision on the exams right to the last minute possible, which struck me as probably really sensible.
Well, I don't know. It's something perhaps that Stuart might disagree with.
Or maybe. So anyway, without further ado, let's see if we can get a snippet from the interview with Sir David Carter and Laura McInerney. Well, I'm delighted to have with me in the studio today the two people who really need no introduction. We've got Sir David Carter, formerly the Regional Schools Commissioner, now working with Ambition Institution, and Laura McInerney, the founder of TeacherTapp, or co-founder of TeacherTapp, I should say, to be entirely accurate, and former editor of Schools Week. Thank you very much both for joining us, and we're going to talk a little bit about a book that you've written together. Laura, you've got a copy of the book right there. Can you hold it up? I've got a PDF on the phone. There it is.
It's all very arty here. Yeah, Leading Academy Trusts.
So tell me, Laura, how you came to write the book with David, because it's very much David's voice and vision in the book.
It absolutely is. And the reason I got involved was knowing David from when I was at Schools Week. We obviously covered his time as the National Schools Commissioner a lot. Sometimes very positively. David will say himself, sometimes not always quite so positive. And it's really important about David's journey through the school sector is he's been the forefront of the academy trusts, the increase in academy trusts. And he was the only person who has been a head teacher, then over a federation, then over a multi-academy trust, then became a regional schools commissioner, and finally the national schools commissioner. So what he's seen in terms of how academy trusts can deliver for young people and how it goes wrong was just, there isn't anybody else out there. And the one thing we agreed on was the title is Leading Academy Trusts, but it does have this, why some fail but most don't. And I only said I would agree to write it if we were going to be honest and talk about the fact that this wasn't just a perfect solution for everything. We had to say when these things didn't work and when they did. So it's been an amazing honor, actually, to be able to sit and listen to David talk so much over the last couple of years and get it into the book. Just an amazing opportunity.
Thanks. So David, tell us a little bit about, from your end, how the process worked.
Well, everything Laura said is absolutely right. It was really important for me to work with somebody that I trusted, and Laura was somebody I have a huge fondness and respect for from the time that we started the work together at Schools Week, and there were a number of moments where fondness may not have been the immediate reaction when Schools Week came out on a Friday, but it was the reporting was always done with great integrity and with real wisdom, I felt. And I knew I was going to find it very difficult to sit down and write a book from scratch, partly because there was so much I wanted to say, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to order it. And so the way that we worked was perfect for me in that we talked about the structure of the book. I would then write some PowerPoint slides about the themes. Laura would then interview me about the slides, and we talk about them, and then she'd write a draft. And from the basis of that draft, I would then start to try to write it in a style that sounded like me, I suppose, and was authentically coming out of my mouth as opposed to any other way of doing it. And I thought as a model, it was great to work that way because it meant that we could completely refine it. And there were a couple of occasions where things changed, policy changed or something else happened, and we were able to adapt to that. So it was a kind of a journey about the academy movement that I was so heavily involved in. But it was also about a journey from how the hell did a music teacher from South Wales get to be the National Schools Commissioner, and I wanted to tell that story because we need more people to think they can do that.
Great, yeah, and so that the way the book reads remarkably well, and you were telling me earlier about the opening letter, which I think is is a great way to start the book. And for those of you, the few viewers that haven't yet read David and Laura's book, it begins with a letter that David writes to himself at the brink of taking up his first headship. David, tell us a little bit about that letter.
So I have to give Laura the credit for this. She talked to me a lot about writing a letter to my former self, imagining that I was on my first day of headship in 1997, and that 30 years later, the 60-year-old David was writing a letter to his younger self. And I took a bit of convincing that was the right thing to do. And originally we talked about putting it as an appendix at the end, because I didn't really want the book to be a leadership book in the sense that other leadership books are about. And Laura then convinced me, absolutely rightly, that we should put it up front and we should open the book with this. And quite often the people who've seen it, colleagues in the system have really liked that. But also my kids and Claire, my wife, she also thought it was a great way to start the book. And so I feel really confident that it's an opportunity to talk a bit about myself and about my journey before we talk about the detail of the text and what the book is fundamentally about. And so for me, leadership is about inspiring people and taking people on a journey with you. And I think the letter articulated some of that and talked about how important it was to be grounded and be authentic and not think you know all the answers. Some of the things which I saw people not always exhibit that led to their downfall.
It certainly comes across as very human. Laura, what gave you the idea then of persuading David to begin in this way?
I think when we got to the end of the book, and we'd been working on it at that point for about a year, and it is quite a dense book. There's a lot in this, and a lot about management, accountability, responsibility. Those are hard things. We've made it as accessible as we can, but there's no getting away from it that some of this stuff is challenging. And so at the end, it felt as if you didn't just want to leave people having discussed governance and accountability. What are the lessons that should sum up the book? So I said to David, you know, an easy way to do that, at least to figure out what the lessons are, might be to sit down and write a letter to yourself. And I think all of us can benefit from that actually as a activity at any moment in time, particularly at the end of a job, perhaps before you move into the next one. You know, what do you wish you'd known? And maybe pass that to the people who are going into your position. So having spent a year writing this, David then goes away for about a day, writes this letter, sends it back, and I read it and I'm in tears. And I'm just like, this is amazing. You know, this person who said, oh, I can't sit down and write, did it completely without me. And I thought, well, not only is this brilliant, but actually it begins the book so well because, yes, it is about leading academy trusts, but people lead academy trusts. A person will be leading it. And we can often lose that human element. And it just brought it in and reminded people that you're going to learn lessons throughout the book that will be important for you. If you don't grasp all of it straight away, that doesn't matter because all of us are learning as we go. And it just opened it up really nicely. It's therefore been brilliant to see so many people pick it up in their reviews on Amazon and in various things on Twitter where people have said this is really good for them. Because, it's such a beautiful piece of writing for which I can take absolutely no credit.
Okay. Oh, well, there's some great stuff in there. So, David, the idea of making, well, not so much an idea, but the advice to yourself about making each conversation a good one. And I really liked that about that. You know, that how you speak to people is really important in building trust and integrity and all of that sort of thing. And you know, reading between the lines, I had this sense of maybe as a head teacher, maybe as a CEO, maybe there are times when you perhaps didn't get that right, and you're reflecting on that from your now, you know, the vantage of your experience now, and like other advice, like run towards conflict. And you know, I'm wondering, are there occasions that we perhaps didn't hear about when you're reflecting on not having done that to the standard that you would have wished?
Well, it's a high bar to do everything that I say in the book, and you know, I'll be the first to say that before people who work for me tell you that I didn't always get it right. But something that I felt was really important to me personally was about respect and trust for people. You know, when you're in a leadership position, whether it's a head or a CEO or even in the jobs that I had in the DFE, there's always going to be an element of those roles where you have to tell people that either what they're doing isn't what you expect them to do, or it's not good enough, or you've got to be able to have a conversation with them about how they do something better. And that conversation always goes so much more effectively when people believe that feedback is coming from a good place. And I used to wrestle with that. I found that very difficult, particularly in my early years of headship, where it's a hell of a lot easier to tell people how well they're doing. But if you look in the mirror and you know that you've actually over-egged that a little bit, you've just been deceitful, both to yourself and to the person that you've given that feedback to. So I certainly think that was a work in progress for me. I've never been the kind of person that is able to just give somebody bad feedback and shatter them and just leave them to pick up the pieces. I think you've got to take them on that journey, and you've got to be part of the help. But you also have to recognize there are times you have to give people a bit of space to reflect on what you've said. And so I think the elements of holding people to account are such an important part of any leader's role. But to do it with integrity, to do it with compassion and warmth, that's really important. I think people often, there's that wonderful Maya Angelou phrase, isn't there, about people sometimes forget exactly what you said, but think more about how you said it to them. Right. And I used to have that quote on the wall in my office in Cabot. And, you know, before I was about to have a difficult conversation, I tried to think what it would be like if I was about to hear what I was about to say to that person being said to me. and to try to help them with that process. And it's working. It's never complete. It's never something you're completely comfortable with, or should be completely comfortable with, to be honest, because you should always be thinking about how you do that better.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip us forward a little bit. We're going to come back to some other things later, but I want to ask you just briefly about the very end of the book, which is a chapter on managing risk. The advice that you give in the chapter on risk, do you think it equally applies to the current state, or would there be things that you'd now be adding?
So actually, we wrote the chapter in April. It was the very last bit of the book that we put together, and we changed what we were originally planning because we were in the lockdown. And it was really apparent to me that I was hearing stories from conversations I was having with trusts around the country at that time that actually being in a trust was not a bad place to be when all of this challenge was being created, and that many trusts were helping maintain schools down the road or standalone academies, to pick up on the last point. And so we did talk about that. And the second half of the chapter, as I recall it, was very much about what might the future look like coming out of this. And I think I made reference to McKinsey's work around the 5 phases of getting to the next normal. And so a lot of it was actually written. I think I even put the date in the book, actually, because I remember ironically thinking, someone's going to read this book in 3 years' time when all of this is over and wonder what the hell he's talking about. So we actually did do that in April. And the point, however, that you make is a fair one, that what we knew in April is very different to what we know now, and the situation is very different. So I think the message around risk being something that you have to have a healthy appetite for, but it shouldn't be, I forget how we call it, it shouldn't be the devil on your shoulder that stifles decision making, nor should the lack of risk awareness mean that you can do whatever you like, is still, I think, very current around that.
So with the sort of decisions that schools are having to make at the moment about how to try to make classrooms and social spaces socially distant, how to operate bubbles and routes around schools, should teachers stay in their classrooms, should teachers be much more peripatetic, and there are risks and potential, costs and benefits to all of those decisions. If you were to sort of, in some way, sum up from a system leader perspective the advice that you think should be taken in here, what might you say?
So that's a tough question, but I would say something along the lines of no, it's fine. I would say something along the lines of this. I think school leaders in the main always feel that they're in control of their own destiny. Change happens quite slowly in the educational world, and of course you can have the phone call from Ofsted in the afternoon changes the direction of travel for a few weeks, maybe, or even longer if it doesn't go how you hope. But fundamentally, change that we're seeing at the moment is unprecedented in certainly my experience around that. And so I think one of the bits of advice would be that you have to accept that this change is beyond your control, and if you try to control the change, you're going to be defeated by it. Right. So I think there's a really strong sense of actually having a reality that there are only so many things that you can control, and I think that then translates into the kind of conversations you have with people about not promising that you can solve all these different problems, because it's just inconceivable that you can do that. I think the second bit of advice would be that we talked earlier on in this conversation about education being a people industry. It's never been more important that we recognize that, and that we are there for our communities, for our children and for the staff, and that we think really strategically about what people need and how we help them, and how we are as mindful about their health and well-being and their mental preparedness to teach as it is about the art and the science of teaching in itself. But I think the third element of it is, and I think I've come to this realization since the start of this academic year, that educational outcomes and educational progress still matters. And if we get too sucked up in this whole notion of just COVID and managing the pandemic, we will lose sight of what the fundamental purpose of schools is, which is to give kids a great education. And whilst I don't mean that we should now put in place rigorous performance management systems. If it was down to me, I wouldn't have Ofsted near a school till next September, but it's not, and therefore that probably won't happen. But actually, to be thinking about the quality of educational experience that children are getting now matters every bit as much now as it did a year ago, I think. And those trusts and those schools who agree with that are still, I think, improving their schools whilst at the same time trying to manage the challenge of the pandemic.
Right. Well, I'm delighted to have with me in the studio today the two people who really need no introduction. We've got Sir David Carter. Well, I should say, Martin, that David Carter is the reason that I went on Twitter. I went to a training course that he was running at a local school when I was head of English, and I go along every week to sort of learn how to be a better leader. And one of the things that he said was that he asked everyone, "Who's on Twitter here?" And a couple of people put their hands up, and he said, "Well, get on Twitter." So I did, because I'm very obedient.
The rest, as they say, is history. He comes across as a really, really nice guy, the sort of guy that you'd want to work for, really.
Well, that might have something to do with his success. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, no, but he certainly does come across very, very well. And it was really...
Do we know how many music teachers have become leaders?
I've no idea, but I'm sure there's somebody out there that can give us the statistics on that. I know more music teachers should be head teachers. Maybe that's the message.
You know, conducting the orchestra and all those sorts of things. You can see the analogies.
You certainly can. And so it's a really interesting interview, and we were very wide ranging, and one of the things that we talked about that didn't make it into that cut was some comments on exams, and it would be interesting to pick those up in light of what Stuart says later on the show. But I definitely picked up the book feeling a little bit that, you know, this is a book for, you know, about leading multi-academy trusts. I'm not going to find it very interesting, and I was absolutely riveted by it. It's a great read, and I think that anyone working in the education industry and the education sector, wherever they are, will find something that will be potentially really, really interesting to them in it. And one of the things that it persuaded me of, that I'd always been really, really skeptical, that multi-academy trusts can be led correctly, are a force for good, and obviously that might put some people's backs up. But I absolutely recommend that you get it. It's available from John Catt, and I'm not just saying that because they're our show sponsors. It's definitely a really interesting read.
Well, there's something perhaps the three CEOs in today's program have in common, if you like. I think something Laura said at the beginning there, the human element about leading and the importance of the human element that David picked up on later. People industry. I'm not so happy about the word industry, but certainly the people side to it. And his themes: respect and trust in people, holding them to account, but with compassion, and focusing on now the great quality of education for the students. I mean, there seems to be a real qualitative, passionate, empathetic way of leading a trust, which instead of the sort of bottom line idea that people have about trusts, perhaps, which is exam results at all costs.
Yeah, sausage factories burning through teachers, and you know, all about results. And it's very much an antidote to that. And it's great that that's a theme that hopefully will emerge with the different system leaders that we've got talking to us in this week's episode. So
if you want to pick up on that, subscribe to this channel, and you will see the full interview when it comes out, and it will come out during the week, as will the interview with Desmond Dean and the interview with Stuart Locke.
So David, Martin,
that's you.
That's me, right? That's great. So you spoke to Desmond Dean earlier in the week. He's the CEO of, is it Odyssey?
The Odyssey Trust, yeah.
The Odyssey Trust, yeah. And tell us a little bit about why you interviewed him.
Well, it came from a tweet, actually. I put a tweet out about the various discussions during the week about the white working class and performance in schools. And one of the comments made to an education select committee about the quality of curriculum, and sort of saying that the curriculum might alienate certain elements of the white working class. So Desmond picked up on that and refuted it, as did a couple of other people. And we started talking about that. And then later on, we talked about other things. But it's Well, let's have a look at his stuff
Yeah.
on the white working class, shall we? The BBC reported a competitive education system and an elitist curriculum do not help address the underachievement of white working class pupils, MPs have heard. And this was tweeted out by me during the week, and a certain Desmond Dean, who is CEO head of Odyssey Trust, and we'll come to that later, tweeted in response, "So a group of university academics explain why elitist universities have put off white working class boys. As a white working class boy, I certainly find them off-putting." So over to you, Desmond. Tell me, what's it like being a white working class boy?
Yeah, I should probably qualify that. I think the boy thing is somewhat in the past. There's only so many words you can put on tweets, so I couldn't explain that. But as somebody who grew up as a white working class boy, I suppose is what the tweet should say. You know, I'm clearly neither a boy or probably somebody who would argue working class anymore. But yeah, I think it's one of those messages that you read and you think, I can't bite my lip on this one. And obviously, I haven't read the data from the research from the academics within it. But I think what came out strongly from that was the irony of university academics lecturing on what the white working class are put off by or encouraged by. And there seemed a sort of massive disconnect between their world and the world that they're referring to. Illustrated by the very fact that they could make that kind of statement, that in somehow going to university or universities themselves are off-putting. And although I said that actually I find them off-putting, I didn't find university off-putting quite clearly, because I went to university myself, and at no point did I find the idea of them being elitist in any way off-putting. In fact, probably the opposite. That's what I was aspiring to do, and I have no reason to believe I'm exceptional in that respect. And I think that's probably what's missing from that debate. I think what underpins that is the fact that we are treating the white working class as some kind of homogeneous group, which has specific characteristics which follow that model, and there's a single culture within that. And I think that's incredibly naive and probably patronising as well.
That's a very important point. I mean, obviously, it was a committee reporting to Parliament, and therefore it wasn't just one view being expressed, and there was a range of views that were expressed at the time. So it's worth looking in more detail at that. But going back to what you said there, which I think is really interesting, is the homogeneity of the white working class. And the idea that university or something is beyond them because they're white working class people. But there is something to be said. If we look at the figures, the white working class, it seems, do not exactly overachieve at school. In fact, they underachieve. So what do you think might be the reasons for that?
Well, I think you can't get away from, first of all, that problem that we've determined that they are a group to be identified, and they're identified partly by their underachievement. So all of those who tick a box that qualifies them as white working class get treated into one lump sum within that, and it hides all the variations that are within it. So it's telling us what we've actually set it up to tell us about just achievement and just this group that we've determined. If we had subgroups within that, it would probably tell us something else. And although it's in no way the same, it does resonate a little bit with the current debate about BAME as an identifier and the issues that actually there's a range of variation within that. And if you split that up, you would get a much more sophisticated understanding. Having said that, there's no doubt that amongst those who underachieve at school, those who would be put within the white working class bracket certainly are significant in terms of that underachievement. But I think if you're not clear about who's in that group first, you can't really make many useful statements about what the causes will be, because the causes are different for different members of those groups. There is no single thing. I think the problem I find is because we've defined it as the white working class, that therefore is also we're defining that as being the problem. that they are underachieving because they are white working class, that there is something fundamentally flawed or problem for the white working class to overcome in order then to be achieving. So it becomes a fairly circular argument in that respect. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's Matthew Goodwin, who's the professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent, told the committee, apparently, terms such as toxic masculinity and white privilege could become more of a problem as we send yet another signal to the white working class community, and we're questioning that they are a problem. So we're identifying all the time that the whiteness is a problem, that the masculinity is a problem for the boys' side of things, obviously. Are we trying to just find problems where there aren't any?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, part of the first issue is deciding with this group that there is a problem with them, that we somehow, or the liberal academic elite, have to somehow solve, is in itself part of the problem. To think that the white working class are reading The Guardian or The Times and concerning themselves about terms like toxic masculinity and white privilege is in itself an issue in terms of the understanding of the white working class. This isn't terminology that I'm sure is being bandied around fairly liberally amongst the white working class. Although they may have issues around the identification or support for particular groups. For a start, I think we have to ask, does the white working class identify itself as a group of white working class in the same way that we are identifying other ethnic minority groups? Do they see themselves as being part of a group which is somehow hard done by attention to other groups? And I'm not sure that's clear that is the case. I'm not sure that they self-identify in that way. The identity has been put on them by, unfortunately, these fairly left-leaning middle-class academics who are a world away from that existence within that, despite any research that might be there. So I think the first thing is determining what are we basing that on? Are the white working class telling us that they're put off by universities because they're elite and they're put off by toxic masculinity and white privilege? I very much doubt that they are. I'm not even entirely certain they've even been asked.
Right. When we get to elitist academics and elitist academe, is there such a thing? Is academia elitist? Well, are we talking about certain subjects? So I'll pick at random, not quite, but Latin. Is Latin suitable for the working class and the white working class for that matter? I'd
probably flip the question around and ask, why wouldn't it be? It depends very much on what you want to. Well, first of all, are you treating a group as having education because it serves a particular purpose? So employment, the old factory model, and I think part of the argument still stem from that understanding of education, that we're not equipping them. They don't need Latin because they're not going to use Latin in any particular job they're going to do. So what's the point? But we don't teach Latin because it's useful necessarily. Not in the work or vocational sense. So deciding for a start what subjects are suitable and which aren't is in itself part of the problem. Why should there be any distinction between what a working class boy and somebody from any other group would study in school? Why shouldn't they be available to study both if they choose to do so? Because in itself, we're already beginning to segregate by deciding that there are certain courses for certain groups and certain courses for others. So that in itself, I think, is a problem. I don't think that it's the subjects or the curriculum or the content that's the issue. And again, part of our problem, I think, with education is we sometimes treat education in isolation as a bubble. And it isn't. It's part of a society, and that society changes, and that society has impacts and influences on the groups that engage in our education. So if we want to, improve the outcomes for the white working class, we can't just do it within schools or within the curriculum or what's taught. It actually also includes that larger cultural context. And that's why a more sophisticated understanding is important. Because do we know what those contexts are? If I give an example, Within that white working class, you first of all have to determine, do we actually are these working class, or are they not working class? So there are some who have not experienced employment or any meaningful employment within their family for some time, compared to somebody who's actually been working. There's first a bit about that, but whether they're working or not. And then there are subgroups within that. So for instance, do we include settled traveller communities within that white working class category? And if so, that's a very different cultural context and very different challenges within that, and a very different perception of education as well. And I think that's why it comes back to that original problem of, if we treat them as a group, do we therefore have to treat them differently as a group? And do we treat them in isolation in education, or do we have to consider the wider societal issues that impact upon that? And I think, yes, so go ahead, Martin.
No, I suppose people talk about our kids at our school, won't get that or won't understand that. I mean, certainly when it comes down to choice of what to put in the curriculum, let's say at exam time, perhaps you could choose certain texts, and you say, well, I don't know if our kids can quite deal with that. Is that something that is reasonable for a school to think, or for teachers to think as they choose texts?
I think it's pretty dangerous. I think what you choose to put into the curriculum, the text, for instance, needs to have some relevance so that it can be accessible. But if you make it too accessible and there's no stretch, then you're not really providing much of an education. So, for instance, just giving boys adventure stories or boy-orientated literature is actually preventing them from experiencing something else. And then we are actually starting to manage their education without having them full participation. Having said that, having a range and diversity and making it accessible, and that sometimes is around scaffolding. You may not go straight into Jane Eyre. You may begin with something else first and scaffold into that, so they have some framework and understanding to engage with it.
Yeah, I suppose if at GCSE you're already saying our kids can't cope with a certain text, then you're admitting failure from what you taught before the GCSE, perhaps.
Yeah, it's no different, I think, than historically, where curriculum decisions were made about particular groups of students in schools that actually channeled them into particular careers or outcomes. You're never going to get a chance to do this, therefore we're going to teach you woodwork. There's no point you learning this, because actually you're not going to get any jobs in that and you're not going to be successful in it. I don't think it's our place to make those decisions for them. I think it's our place to overcome those barriers that they might be experiencing, aside from where they are. So, and don't we do that for every other group of students? When they enter schools, don't we begin with some kind of assessment of their previous performance, whether they have any SEN needs, etc. And don't we put in then scaffolding and support and interventions? We don't decide that SEN students have to have a completely different curriculum because they're SEN. We try to actually make it possible for them to access the full curriculum, wherever that's possible, by actually putting in the support that they need. Why would we treat any other group differently from that? That becomes social engineering.
Yeah, some interesting points there, Martin, about if we're in schools, if we're saying these children can't cope with this in school, then we are closing down an awful lot else, aren't we?
Yeah, and Desmond talked a lot about that, but I was, and this didn't come out in that interview, but will come out during the week. I was still interested in how he copes with a trust that has one grammar school and one secondary modern school, because I think that's a very interesting mix, shall we say?
Yes, it is. And you from one perspective, you might see those as binary opposites, and never the twain shall meet. And trying to integrate those must be really interesting. Can you tease us some of his answer there, Martin?
Well, it's no. I don't want to give the game away, but certainly talking about when children are identified as being able to be a grammar school student or a secondary modern school student might be one of the things we covered. So whether it should be 11 or later on, most schools do it. It's sixth form, of course, certainly
Yeah.
when we get to university age. But so there are interesting questions around that, about how they share resources and staff and also subjects around both schools. But it's very early days. It's about 2 years in, I think, as a trust as a whole.
Right.
So it's certainly an interesting experiment, shall we say?
Okay, so what do we think? What do we think about the white working class being either a homogenous group or not being? What's your view on that, Martin?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? That he was talking about, as soon as you identify a group, do they identify themselves as a group? And we identify groups and then track their performance and say they are a problem or they're not a problem, and try and do things about them as a homogenous group. And of course, everyone in a homogenous group, which we all are in various different homogenous groups, knows full well that we are not fully paid up members to that group in any way. So
yeah, it's a really interesting one. So, you know, like many people I've met on the educational voyage, I'm the first member of my family to go to university and get a degree and and a profession, so to speak. And certainly, I think Desmond, sort of at the beginning of the interview, there's that reticence that we have that I don't know if I could any longer describe myself as working class and that sort of thing, and that's really interesting. That lots of the in the discussions that we have about identity today. The identities are, by some people, certainly considered more or less permanent, and that the idea of what class you belong to is maybe less secure. I definitely feel embarrassed about describing myself as working class today. I don't know whether you identify with that, Martin. Obviously,
I always think of the Tony Benn quote. It's not where you're from, it's where you're at that matters. And of course, he wasn't denying his working class roots with that. He was talking about Viscount Transgate, I think it was. So talking about his aristocratic roots, that he could become plain old Tony Benn and drink lots of tea, I think, and things like that. So I don't know. Can we move classes? I suppose if you move jobs, you move class sometimes. If you become a CEO of a trust, you perhaps are a different class than the son of a plumber or whatever you were in your youth. Yeah,
a little bit like Sir David there, talking about his journey from being a music teacher in South Wales to the national figure he is now. That what we do, what we choose, it has a great deal to do with our identity, and that maybe is something that's a little bit left out of the debate about identities.
Well, it's interesting. Our next talk with a CEO is with Stuart Locke, who talks about the importance of exams. And part of what he was talking about exams is the importance of them for less privileged groups and the opportunities that exams actually offer.
Yes, just before we nip to that, one of the I think it was in TES or Schools Week, I'm not sure which, but reading an interview with I can't remember her name for the life of me now, but this woman who was talking about being from looked after child and having an unfortunate start, and how exams had been her salvation, and I think that it's very, very interesting that people who in different ways are privileged because of where we've ended up, perhaps, if nothing else, make pronouncements about what children like that need, and children like that have all of these problems and need to be catered for in all of these different ways. And Stuart's got some interesting ideas about that, hasn't he?
He has indeed. Let's take a look.
Let's have a look. Absolutely.
Okay, and now we've got Stuart Locke, who's going to talk to us about a few things, but he's a CEO. He used to be a head teacher, I believe, of Bedford Free School, and has now turned it into a bit of a mat. Now, you came to fame, I'm going to say, recently for writing a letter to, I think, which paper was it?
It was the Daily Telegraph.
The Daily Telegraph. That's it. The
No,
Daily
that's not
Telegraph.
true. It was the Sunday Telegraph. My apologies.
Sunday Telegraph.
Slightly
Yes.
different.
And tell me about your letter.
So, like, in some of the responses to the pandemic, it feels like the government, particularly around education, have followed some of what has happened in Scotland over, you know, the closure of schools and things like that, and sometimes correctly, sometimes learning from them. I don't have any criticism of that. But at the time that the Scottish government elected to say in advance, really early on, they're going to cancel the national examinations. I think they're called the
Hires?
The higher fives or something like that. Or like at the time they said that really early on, I had a kind of my immediate reaction, and the reaction of a colleague I was talking to, was after last year and the chaos that happened in the summer with the GCSE and A-level results and the fiasco that we really couldn't manage as a system. Why would you want that to happen again? And in fact, it'll be even harder this time, because people know that last time that the teacher assessments, the centre assessed grades, the centre assessments, I should say, not the teacher assessments, were taken as the actual results. So the pressure on schools would be huge. I couldn't see any benefit to announcing that so early. And so given that, you know, our job as a school trust is to, you know, say what we think, to make the best bets for the system, and to try and influence the system to do the best thing for young people, I contacted, you know, people that I know, people around that I know, other head teachers and a few CEOs, and just said, do you agree with me, and should we make public our opposition to this the same thing happening in England? And so, you know, my view is that examinations are the best way of assessing, as best we can, the learning of young people. It doesn't mean I think they're perfect. It doesn't mean I think that every way that they're used is right. It doesn't mean that I necessarily think that the very high levels of accountability attached to them, particularly in unprecedented times, are necessarily right. But I do think we need the best way of assessing young people, and examinations do that blind. You know, they do it without knowing the young person and so on. If I'm somebody who wants to maintain my privilege, who wants to maintain the privileges of a middle-class education, or an education that's being paid for, one of the things I might do is get rid of the blind, non-biased assessment that allows people to leapfrog above me. And I think if we get rid of exams, we get rid of that opportunity for, in particular, those who are most disadvantaged, to show that the impressions of them because of their background, or the unfair stereotypes of them, actually aren't true, and that they're capable of exactly the same as those who go and pay for their education, like many, you know, like the 9% that do in private schools. So I think examinations, it's absolutely crucial we hold on to them. And I think it's also crucial because of the precedent. Like, I don't know much about the pandemic, but my bet is that it's not going away anytime soon, and the effect is going to be held for some significant time. If we get rid of examinations at age 16 or even 18 this year, having done so last year, like, in terms of the precedent, why wouldn't that happen again the year after, and the year after that? And so we end up with a kind of in a what I think is likely to be a much more difficult situation for the education system, in terms of knowing what our kids know, in terms of knowing whether our kids are prepared, our pupils are prepared for the next stage of their education, and in terms of, like, just across the whole system, like whether, like, the implied alternatives to examinations, those things like teacher assessment and so on, that while they sound very attractive, have bigger problems down the line that I think we can avoid. So I think it's really essential that examinations take place. And the reason the letter came about is because a number of people very, very quickly, more than I anticipated, said, I'm absolutely happy to put my name to this. And we did it in about 24 hours and sent it off, and got a modicum of attention. And I'm pleased that on the Monday after the letter was published, the Secretary of State said that exams will go ahead. he was open, and I think he should be, to alternatives, but I think it's really important that they go ahead, and I'm pleased that he said that.
Do you think your letter tipped him over the edge to
No, I
bring
wouldn't
to
say
that?
that at all.
Or was it coincidence?
I have no idea. I think that lots of people have said the same thing. We just wanted to add our weight to what's being said.
Now, there's quite a movement with certain elements of the education world who are trying to get rid of GCSEs as they are and replace them with, you were talking about, things like teacher assessments, and perhaps thinking about not doing it at 16 and perhaps moving it on to 19 as well, and a wider range of courses, all sorts of things being talked about there. One of the things I was interested in what you just said and picked up on is that exams are fairer than teacher assessment. Now, is that because teachers are unconsciously biased, perhaps, or is it because the system, you mentioned accountability, the system is so geared towards performance, not just of the pupil, but of the teacher and the school, that it's very difficult for teachers to be completely unbiased?
Yeah, like possibly both. I mean, the first thing is that I'm not saying that teachers cheat. Like, of course they don't. They go into the profession to want pupils to learn and so on, but they're also human. And so we make, as humans, we make shortcuts to our assessments of all sorts of things. And we do that in the classroom. And I think every teacher has set an examination circumstance and gone, oh, I'm really surprised at how this pupil did, either well or badly. And there's and the reason for that is because we can't have a complete assessment of what's going on inside the pupil's head, certainly not as a proxy. So what I mean is a proxy for what they learn. We can't have a complete understanding of every single thing that goes on in a pupil's head. We're in a complex business. But we're also human and we're biased, and our shortcuts can include things that we're not aware of. And I think that we know that particularly disadvantages those that are poorer, possibly disadvantages those with various levels of protected characteristics. We know about the labelling of pupils with, for example, SEND, like all of those things. I think we risk. But of course, as well, we have the GCSEs are high stakes for schools. We know about league tables. We know that they have an impact on possible inspections. They can affect careers and they can end careers if they're not good enough. And to some extent, if pupils aren't learning in a school, of course we need to be accountable to that, and there needs to be some high level of accountability. But the minute something becomes a high stakes measure, it becomes a less accurate measure of what the case is. And that's the case actually for examinations as well. That's why we see teaching to the test, or we see a very narrow curriculum, for example, at secondary school, where you end up with GCSE papers or GCSE in year 7, or you end up with the specification for the GCSE becoming the subject rather than teaching the subject itself. I feel like I'm getting into curriculum much more, Martin, but that's the case for examinations itself. It's even more the case if we had teacher assessments, right? Like, so the pressure to get very, very strong results is strong. I guess that those people would say, well, take away that accountability and so on. But I think we should be accountable for people's learning. And I think it's absolutely the best way is an externally moderated assessment. The best way of doing that, frankly, is a test. And so, I'm open to other forms of assessment. I'm open to looking at assessment and making the case for exams. I'm open to, there might be a better way, although I can't think of it, but that we're not going to do that by the summer of 2021.
Right. Well, the summer of 2021 is obviously the case in point, the most immediate concern for schools and pupils and parents. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks, let alone months, but there will be some disruption, I should think, to some schooling for some pupils, and it might be many pupils or it might be a few pupils, we don't know. But can any exam be fair if the amount of teaching, and I mean face-to-face teaching in classroom as teaching here, and that might be something to talk about anyway, but can it be fair if it's at the same level of exams 2 years ago, for example? Or do we need to make changes to the exam system? I know it's been put back 3 weeks, for example, so they're obviously thinking about this, but should other changes perhaps be taken on board to alleviate the problems that are obviously in the pipeline?
So there's a couple of questions in what you've said, so please come back to me if I don't answer them completely. You asked if exams are fair. And I think the fairest exam is one that accurately measures what pupils have learned as accurately as we can. Like we call that being valid and reliable, like as a valid measure of what the pupils have learned and what they know and can do and so on. And I think that's the most important function of exams. Of course, education is not fair, and that's something that my trust exists to fight against. It's not fair that pupils who pay for their education get smaller class sizes. It's not fair that they have extended hours. It's not fair that you go to a school in an advantaged area and you have a different quality of education than in a disadvantaged area for all sorts of reasons that are not the fault of the people going to those schools. It's not fair that we have those things are not fair. Examinations aren't the route to mitigating that. The route to mitigating that is making schools better. And of course, during the pandemic, some of those things about the provision of education is even more unfair. It's really unfair that in some schools at the moment you have 40 or 50 or 60% of pupils at home self-isolating, learning online, which with the best will in the world and all the incredible things that teachers have done isn't as good as face-to-face. I don't think anybody would claim it is. Of course that's unfair, but that doesn't mean the examination should pretend that pupils know more than they do. The alternative to assessing pupils and saying this is what they know is that we assess them and we give them grades for what they don't know. And to me that seems nonsensical. What I do think is important is what those examinations are used for. So the letter actually says that sixth forms and universities should consider the circumstances under which the examinations were sat, should be more flexible with admissions criteria. It might be the case that if I've done a bit not as well as I could have done in my maths examination because I've been off for 2 or 3 terms and I've been learning at home, that actually I might have the potential to do better, or I might have done better with better teaching. I might be able to catch up quicker, but that's a function of using what we know to be accurate. We still need to know. If I'm a sixth form, I want to know they didn't do very well in their maths exam, and I probably have to do some work about it to make sure they can do their maths A level or whatever it might be. So I think the function of exams in terms of fairness, a fair exam measures as accurately as possible what the pupil knows and can do, and I think that's crucial. Should there be flexibility? Absolutely there should be flexibility. Like, we should be considering everything possible to make the assessment of what pupils know and can do as valid and reliable as possible come the summer of 2021. So I know that actually sitting exams is going to be difficult in loads of schools, and I think there's a kind of feeling of where there's a will, there's a way. We need to be planning for that now with socially distancing and all the things that we need to do to mitigate the pandemic. And to stop the spread. Things like the spreading over, putting it back 3 weeks, perhaps that helps in terms of the delivery of the curriculum. But also, I think it's really sensible to have an English and a maths exam early on, because if there's a circumstance of isolation, of self-isolating, where pupils can't sit the examinations, but they've sat something that's valid and reliable, that's a better proxy for how they would have done than, for example, the centre assessed grades we had last year, or whatever it might be. And I think that's it's important that I think it was a smart move to do that. I'm really open to solutions that allow us to get a good assessment of what pupils know and can do, and I think we should be flexible in our solutions around that. But I think the very last thing we should do, and what I'm saying here is we shouldn't do it, is get rid of examinations full stop. They must go ahead. I recognise there'll be challenges, and I can't imagine any circumstances where there aren't going to be thousands of pupils who can't sit individual examinations because of their needing to isolate or quarantine. And I think we need to be open to how we deal with that as a system. I'm really open to solutions around that. And I think we've got some of the smartest people in education. We can work through these problems and get through them.
Oh, great interview, Martin. Really, really good. And interestingly, when viewers get to listen to the full interview with Laura and David, I think they'll see that the position suggested there is actually not very far away from what Stuart wants. But it's nearly 7 o'clock and it's prize draw time, isn't it? There's Martin's hat. And this week we're giving away copies of Peps McRae's book, Motivated Teaching. And Martin, over to you. Who's won a copy? We've got 2 copies to give away. Who should we give them to?
Here we go. So you need to subscribe to get in the draw. And the first one out is Patrick Alexander. Patrick Alexander.
Get in touch. The email is inbox. Oh, I can't remember what it is. I can't remember what the email is. Can we put it up? Can we do that? The email's coming right up. So Patrick, get in. Send a message to the. There we are. Hello at wastingyourtime.co.uk. That's the email, Patrick, for you to get in touch. To claim your.
In case you miss it, it's down in the comments underneath as well. And the other person who wins is Jenny Davis. So please,
Jenny,
both of you, get in touch and subscribe. Don't miss out on all the wonderful content.
You were saying earlier that Carl Hendrick still hasn't claimed the books that he's won.
Carl is, he has to get in touch. I mean, I'm sure he will.
Carl, hello at wastingyourtime.co.uk. Get in touch with us, and we've got copies of 2 books to give to you. I think from memory, it's Symbiosis and Mary Myatt's book Back on Track, which who wouldn't want? So Carl, get in touch and we'll send those to you. Everybody else, if you'd like to be in with a chance of winning a copy of David Carter and Laura McInerney's book, Leading Multi-Academy Trusts, then do subscribe. If you're not a subscriber, then you're not entered into the weekly draw.
And it might be even possible to give away Stuart Locke's book on leadership, which is coming out with a Research Ed title, and he's edited it, and lots of lovely names of people who are involved in that. And that's also a John Catt book, and that could go into the prize draw as well. So we have perhaps 2 books on leadership, 1 David Carter and 1 Stuart Locke.
Stuart Locke and Co. Yeah, why not? Let's do that. So anyway, it's been lovely. It's been a great edition. It's the CEO edition, and I hope you've enjoyed it. We're back next week, same time, same place, and don't forget, it's if you've not enjoyed it, it's your time you've wasted. Thank you very much, Bob.
Okay.
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble